Hello, Aero.
Hey,
You
how's it going?
joined pretty good. You joined the PVG community like it was like a week ago or something.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you kind of like shared a little bit of your expertise in design. And I immediately was like, I really want this guy to be on this devlog because I don't know if you noticed yet, but most of the PVG people are just totally technically based. They don't have any idea
hmm
about design. We have a good variety, and a Swindle that I had on again for the same reason. He is great at design, but he doesn't do it professionally. He's professionally a dev.
hmm
So I would love to hear more about design, but first I wanted to ask you what brought you to the PVG community.
Yeah, I dealt with PBBGs in the past. I'm still getting acquainted with the name PBBG because I actually didn't know the games were called like that. All I had in my mind was Travian, Tribal Wars, Icarium, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and O Game. Like those were the staples for me when I was a child. But I didn't know it actually had a specific type of name and like, oh yeah, these are PBBGs. It made sense once I stumbled upon it. And I found it on Reddit, I think, because there was a thread on strategy games. I'm a big fan of strategy games. And there was a comment like, you could find more about this on PPGs. I'm like, okay, what is that? I'm going to check it. And then I saw the Reddit page and I saw they actually have a podcast and I saw the Discord channel. Like, yeah, definitely. That's what brought me here. Yeah.
What do you think of the community so far?
I'm a strongly opinionated person,
Good.
but I'm hesitant to actually say my opinions until I have like a fully formed and confident answer about it. But so far, I'm definitely, I don't know how to say it. I'm very surprised to see that people are willing to share one another, and in a polite manner and non-condescending manner, giving positive feedback and reinforcements, which is a surprise because the internet isn't necessarily that such of a great place at times. You
Yeah,
probably encountered several stories and so on and so forth, and definitely was a pleasant surprise in this area.
yeah, and developers are especially bad at things nicely sometimes. I know I am, but yeah, I love the community so far. Cool. Well, so in that spirit of a helpful community, any advice you have for us less design competent people?
Okay, I'm gonna start with design as a concept. And then I'm gonna try to tell you how they can be applied in design processes, how they look like. And then I'll try to give examples along the way, as in how they can be applied specifically in some context and so on and so forth. And then eventually we can wrap it around and see if there are any types of scenarios that you've encountered or seen other people encounter specifically addressing more specific topics about this area.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah. To start off, I'm a bit of a nerd. I studied psychology at university, and I knew since then that design and especially the user experience part is the way I wanted to go. And basically, this is the lens I'm usually reviewing things about. And ever since I learned how to code, that completely made my perspective from a three-dimensional one to a fourth dimensional one, so to speak. Basically, it added a new layer on top, and okay, I see how these things are intertwined together.
Nice.
And I think I'm lucky because of this perspective, because when it comes to design, the beauty of it is that it applies to basically everything. It can apply to any type of problem, any type of idea, whether the scope is large, whether the scope is small. And often when people talk about design, there's a common misconception that design is art. It's the visual part, it's the nice stuff, makes things look pleasant. But what it's actually about is that design is used while art is consumed. I don't like this word, you consume art, but that's what people usually refer to art with. But design is basically bridging the gap between form and function. This is how it's basically usability at its core. And this usability transforms through a process in problem solving, where problem solving is at a base. And I would argue that designers have more in common with developers and other types of problem solvers than actually creative industries and arts and visuals and so on and so forth. It is an intertwined skill, but at its core, we put our hats on, the thinking hats on, the critical thinking hats on, and first we start asking ourselves what we're trying to solve. But we'll get to that a bit later. When it comes to usability, the idea is that there are basically two dimensions that we need to take into account. The first dimension is the user's subjective feelings about a design system, how basically they perceive the product they're using, the system. This doesn't necessarily need to be a digital product. It can be basically even a phone receiver or a fridge or or a stove. And the other part of usability is the objective performance of the system, which basically we measure effectiveness, whether this thing helps me solve my problem, this thing helps me achieve the goal I want to achieve. And when we talk about these two, they are heavily intertwined, and there are a couple of things which we look when we want to measure usability. The first thing we usually look about is efficiency, assuming that everything is reliable, there are no issues with me solving my task and so on regarding effectiveness. Assuming everything is all right, then we take a look at how quickly basically we are able to achieve a task. We're thinking about automations, we're talking about shortcuts. For instance, if I know that my players, I have a limited experience in game design, but I'm trying to pair it with game design as much as possible. I've been working on the PBBG for actually tomorrow's the 3 month mark for it. So
Oh, nice.
take everything, basically eat the fish, spit the bones. And
Yeah.
when it comes to effective efficiency, we're thinking about, okay, I have a task which I know users will perform, I don't know, maybe 10 times, 20 times a session. That may be a lot if that task would take me 20 or 30 clicks. So this would be one aspect of effectiveness when you're talking about usability. We're thinking about how quickly am I able to perform the task? And then we can talk about learnability as the second pylon, which is how easy it is for me to learn what I'm using. Whether we're talking about an onboarding process, whether we're talking about clear and concise instructions, we're also talking about intuitiveness over here. We need to take into account basically the player's mental models. If we know that our players are strategy players, they're already familiar with some types of behavioral patterns. Maybe they know that the minimap is on the left. I'm talking about Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2. Everybody knows that as a staple.
Yeah.
And also users expect resources to always be displayed on the top bar where they can also navigate between tabs. Basically, everybody has this is where I was referring to the user's subjecting feelings. Basically, they have they expect how everything is structured some way or another. You can disrupt those expectations, but that usually will add a lot of friction for the learnability of the players. And another thing it would add friction to, which is the third pylon of usability, it's memorability. Because one example I have at hand here is Blender. If you ever used it,
Yeah.
I don't know, I use it like 3 or 4 times a year, but every single time I need to open it, I need to go through the entire process of learning the UI again, where the specific things are, which I'm interested in finding and so forth. And basically, this also ties back to what users' mental models are, and it also ties intuitiveness as a whole. Another thing we can consider, which is also very important regarding usability, is tolerance. This is the fourth one, and when I'm talking about tolerance, basically, I'm talking about how does the system create affordances for my biases and mistakes? As in, what if I need to input how many resources I want to transfer to another player? What if I press an extra zero out of just as a typo or anything like that? Give the players some leeway, both in preventing mistakes, but also providing recovery options. And when we do this type of thing, especially if we have systems which give clear feedback about what the player is doing, okay, this is a fault on the error side, or maybe I don't know, the client doesn't support JavaScript. You can expect anything regarding this. Basically, when we take care of this aspect of our products, what usually happens is two things. First would be that players would be more permissive with your application. They will be more forgiving, as in, okay, this might not be the most advanced user experience you could ever see on the internet, but at least this system allows me to do what I'm doing and do it in a correct manner. And then they would be more forgiving about any types of other frictions. And the second thing that it usually does, which is as a lifesaver for us developers, it's basically reducing the amount of support we need to provide, because we no longer need to retrieve any type of data. We no longer need to pay attention to a lot of different and solve a lot of tickets regarding, I don't know, any type of recoveries or any types of reverting back to any previous states and so on and so forth. And the last part, which also is very important, of usability is satisfaction, the fifth one. It's basically making the things look nice. And returning back to the previous example, in which if I have a task which I need to do 20 times 20 times a session, I better make sure that task feels good. As in it could be basically it's offering the players an enjoyable and a comfortable experience. And moreover, it's also very closely tied to having appealing aesthetics as well, because this is what users usually relate to the most. This is what also appeals most emotionally to the users as well. Whether it's we're talking about even lore could be aesthetics if you want to argue philosophically about this. But basically, it's creating that environment which allows the users to immerse themselves in and care about what they're doing. Because if I have an Excel file, I may not be as invested emotionally compared to an actual game. And this would be like design in a nutshell. It's always about how can I make a thing which can be as easy as possible for the people to use. How can I make it like users don't need to ask themselves, how do I use this thing? For instance, we can look about the old telephone receivers. Just by the form of the object, it was conveying the information that you put it on the ear, and then you also have the mouthpiece. Exactly.
Yeah.
You don't you don't spend 10 minutes trying to decipher what it does. And that's it in a nutshell. I know it's
Yeah.
quite a lot of information, but this is just opening Pandora's box. There's more.
Yeah, yeah. I would love to talk more about each of these, but the probably the one I'm most interested in is the aesthetics because it's so hard to do that. Is that true? Is that just me? Is it just the hardest to make things look and feel good, to be enjoyable to use? Like I can make things work, I feel like, but to make them like something someone's like, oh, that's nice, to
Hmm.
click a button seems a little harder. Or maybe there's just a bunch of tricks. I don't know. What do you think?
There definitely are tricks, but that's what they are, tricks. If you spend I don't know for a better comparison, but if you spend $10 as a product, expect value of $10 or less. And basically, I wouldn't rely necessarily on tricks. Usually tricks fall into the dark pattern types of area. And when I'm referring to dark patterns, I'm referring to evil mechanisms of trying to capture the user's attention as much as possible, or trying to capture as much profits as possible from the users and so on. And it's very easy to try to charm the player, but at the core, if you don't have a good game or a very easy to learn and usable game, that would be the main issue, no matter how pretty it is.
Interesting.
That's the first thing. And when it comes to this was also the idea I was developing on the Discord channel, which is that when it comes to design, it's much easier to get design principles in place instead of trying to add flowers and sprinkle, I don't know, visual decorations and so on and so forth. Because after all, when it comes to pleasing aesthetics, it's usually only what I need to see. That's it. If I have more information than I need to see, that might result in cognitive load, that might result in distractions about what's important as well. Obviously, you can have a lot of details and so on and so forth, but those details, Muriel, they should always be complementary to what the user actually needs to pay attention to.
Hmm.
And when I'm talking about this, to give more concrete examples, I'm talking about hierarchy of information, which boils down to the question, what is the most important thing that the user needs to see at this moment? Whether is it a title of the page? Is it the resources that they need to have, that they currently have available? Whether are there any cues that they need to be aware of if anything is about to happen? I don't know how much time and so on and so forth. You need to make an ideally an informed decision, because when we're talking about the initial phases of game design, you're making a lot of assumptions, and then you test the game to a couple of players, and then you gather feedback. So it's an iterative process. And apart from this, it comes to proximity and spacing. If, for instance, a couple of actions are closely paired together from a functional perspective, maybe all of them should belong to the same place. I shouldn't have one action at the top of the screen. I shouldn't have one other one at the bottom of the screen. Basically, it's grouping themes together, themes of information, themes of functionality. If I have a component in my browser which tells me about the quests that I have available, I'm not going to put the accept quest button in the navigation bar. This is an extreme example, but just to illustrate the idea and so on and so forth. And another thing we can also talk about is contrast. Contrast helps a lot when we're talking about hierarchy of information, and it also helps a lot when we're talking about accessibility.
Hmm.
Accessibility is a very important factor when we're talking about any type of product. We need to make sure that people with any type of visual impairments are able to see. Maybe some people cannot perceive all the types of colors. Maybe they only see in grayscale. But if I make sure that this color is saturated or dark enough compared to the background or vice versa, despite them not being able to perceive the actual color of the button, they can perceive the contrast of it.
Mm,
And this is just another small glimpse. Maybe I want to make sure that people are able to play the game without a mouse. Maybe I want to make sure that people are able to basically navigate very easily between sections of the page or pages without a mouse, as another example. When Google does a very good thing as an example when it comes to this, if you press tab on your keyboard, before you dive into the actual content of the search results, there is an invisible link which is only accessible through the keyboard, which says skip to content. And this is before the search bar. It's the first thing that is highlighted when you press the tab on your keyboard, because basically the alternative of not accessing that, of not pressing on that skip to content button to reach the search results would be to tab between, I don't know, 10 to 20 buttons before I actually reach the link I'm interested in.
I see.
There are a lot of ways to go about this. I wouldn't dive into more, but I could give more examples of this in the design processes when we're talking about those.
Okay. Yeah. We can go there if you want. Did you have anything else?
I think when it comes to aesthetics, because I need to answer that question, not just evade it with design principles. When it comes to aesthetics, it really comes down to craftsmanship. That's the hard truth. As much as we'd like to make something very, very pretty, there is no secret formula. You can find a couple of tricks, but they won't take you far. It's just an iterative process, just doing it over and over again and going a lot with. This is the more creative part of design, of course, and you could argue that there's some art about it, but I would focus first and foremost on solving the problem, and then eventually I'll stress myself out about, okay, how can I try to make this as appealing as possible? But again, these types of interactions need to be complementary to the function. The form should follow the function as well. And when we're talking about interactions, for instance, or animations, we want to have them, I don't know, 150 milliseconds at most. If there's anything more about that, that's more distracting than it should be. It might feel fast for some people, maybe even 200 milliseconds, but anything above even 250 or 300 is way too much already for an
Mm,
animation. Also needs to be done often, or which hides a big part of information. You want to be able to get to things as much as possible in as least of a distracting manner as possible. If I need to get to a page, I don't want to have a seizure because I have 50 flashes in a transition. I want to just have a smooth, smooth animation between the two. That's it, which I don't know can take 250 milliseconds or something like that.
that's a good one.
This is like, you could argue that this is sort of a trick, but it's rather an insight which you get again through iterative processes, gathering feedback and so forth. There is no other way around it, especially if you haven't exercised about this.
Yeah, I think there's an analog for developers for writing software systems that I've found, and I might start a big battle here. Comment your disagreements. But object-oriented programming versus functional programming. Object-oriented programming is like, I am going to create the structure before I know what exactly goes in the
Yeah.
objects, and I'll just add things to this bucket. Whereas
Hmm.
functional is like, I have no idea what it's going to be, so I'm just going to create the pieces as I go and just pull the pieces together as I need them and weave them kind of fluidly. And it sounds like it's the same with design. Because when I design, I do the same thing. I'm like, okay, this is where all the ship stuff goes. And then it just ends up being like 10 things with no hierarchy, like you're saying. And
Hmm.
there's no flow. So the art of designing that and making that good, if in the way you're saying, seems kind of the same thing. Instead of throwing everything in a bucket, you have to kind of iteratively okay, I need this piece, and now think about, how I need to weave that together in a fluid way. So I think,
Exactly.
okay, cool. I can get that.
Exactly. And it also has another dilemma very common with development as well. It's whether you should also have a top level of top down approach or bottom up, because usually when we're talking about architecture as well, we have a top level approach. We're trying to identify the main themes and how basically the tree grows with every type of system that is involved, every type of component that is involved. But mostly when we're talking about implementing this type of stuff, it's from the bottom up. So
Yeah.
there is a balance you need to do between the two. I mean, I wouldn't pick a side between functional object-oriented programming. I would use both. Obviously, there are perks in using any type, both of them in different types of scenarios. But when it
Yeah.
comes to game development, I mean, so far, especially when we're dealing with composition and so on and so forth, I think the object-oriented programming is the saner way to approach things. Not the only way, but ideally, yeah.
I don't do any object oriented programming, and
Okay.
I kind of grew up with React. So
Mm-hmm.
functional programming, I don't know if you've ever heard of that fun function channel. It's not around anymore, but that had a big influence on me. But I have recently, only in the past like couple months, found places where I'm like, oh, that's why people use object oriented programming. It would be so nice if this just had a little tiny state in it, and kind of just knew about itself a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I could see that,
basically.
yeah. But that's only when I've
And
been working on this game. So maybe you're like
hmm
you said, it's very
yeah,
relevant to game things where things are objects and they have a little bit of state. Yeah.
yeah, because otherwise you're just concerned about inputs and outputs, and that's it.
Yeah.
But one thing I would tie, because I think design and development is a very good comparison, and I think they're also very closely tied together.
Hmm.
Design processes also apply to development. You could
Hmm.
argue to some extent development was also design from some perspectives, because in essence, it's another problem-solving skill, and it's also architectural focused. It's also implementation focused. There's also creativity involved. There may be 100 ways of solving the same problem as well, and each of them has its own perks and so on and so forth. So usually how I talk to developers about design is exactly how I would talk about code as well. And
Hmm.
this is it's very closely tied together. Obviously, there are a lot of differences in implementation when it comes to techniques and so on. But even in design, we have components inside components inside components inside components, as you're familiar with front end as well. And
Hmm.
it's the same. It's the same when it comes to actually approaching stuff. And this is where I was building up to with everything that I was explaining earlier, because it doesn't matter the scope or the problem or the idea we're trying to solve. We're just trying to do two things basically. And when I'm describing this, I'm describing the double diamond process. That's one of the most popular ones. There's also design thinking. These are I would say the two most common approaches when you're talking about design. It's basically a framework of steps that you can use in order to make sure that you're solving the problem. They are very similar. They're just, I don't know, it's like using, I don't know, React and Vue. There are differences, but they solve the same thing and so on and so forth. And the two things I was mentioning, especially when you're talking about the double diamonds, we have the first diamond, which is basically doing the right thing. This is where I want to spend a lot of time to discover what's the actual problem I'm trying to solve. Because usually when we encounter a problem, we encounter it through symptoms, I feel some way or so on and so forth, or we encounter it through signs. I see something happening, I don't know, on the street in this game and so on and so forth, or I want to see something happening and so on. And the second diamond would be doing the thing right. Because first we want to understand what problem we're trying to solve,
Hmm.
and then we are trying to understand how we want to solve that problem. And we can start with the first one, which usually this is the discovery process of design. It's also the research phase as well. And what's beautiful about this double diamond is that this is how the process is actually shaped. First, we have a divergent approach to the things. And when we're talking about a divergent approach, it's very important to take our critical hats off. In this phase, there are no such thing as good ideas or bad ideas. This is the space in which we want to generate as many ideas as possible. We can talk to potential players. We can conduct primary research, which is basically looking at other games which are in the same genre or industry as the ones we're making. We can can also do secondary research. Maybe I'm not looking at games, but maybe as a PBG player, I'm looking at data heavy systems, see how they manage to display a lot of information in a very small screen size, how they might make them responsive as well. How do how how do they structure their information in a clear and concise way, and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
We can also rip the brief completely, as in what if there are giant ants with top hats? What if we try to put a man on the moon with this idea? You can go crazy, but the whole point is to generate as many ideas as possible. And at one point, when doing so, you're going to reach a tipping point in which, okay, I have all these all these ideas, what do I actually do with them? This is when we can put back our critical hats on, and this is where the whole process converges, in which we start to identify themes and patterns and all these ideas that I have. Maybe I found that a lot of people solve this solution this way. Maybe I've noticed that there are there are multiple types of players that have different types of needs in these types of games. And maybe some players focus on the PvP aspect, maybe some focus on the PvE axis and so on and so forth. Maybe there are people who want both of them at the same time. Why not? And this is where we start to basically identify patterns and form clusters. And based on those clusters, we then can form hypotheses. We can perform, we can define problem statements in which we identify correctly what we're trying to do essentially, boil it down to as a concise idea as much as possible. It would be our North Star guiding us forward in the process. It will be our main point of reference because this process is very long, as you are well aware of, and it's very hard to get lost in details. But having defined somewhere, put it on a whiteboard or on a piece of paper, what you're trying to do after you've done all the research and figured out all the concepts you want to include in your game and so on. Based on that, you should always come back to this North Star, regardless of what you're trying to implement or evaluate. Okay, does this feature I'm building right now make sense with that North Star I put in the star, I put in this, put in the sky to guide me through this whole process? Does it fit in everything that I've gathered so far and drill down to the raw and it's as essential as possible idea that I managed to boil down my game to? And through this frame, we will have clarity moving on to any type of feature we want to implement. Based on this, we can refine how the game loop should feel as well, whether it makes sense with all the themes that I've gathered, whether this game loop can fulfill all the players' needs and all the player types as well. And once we've reached this problem statement, this challenge that we're trying to overcome, then the second diamond would appear. Okay, I know what I want to do, but how do I do it? And this usually comes through forming, again, hypothesis. Okay, I found out that maybe this type of system would solve the solution I'm looking for, but I also saw there are a couple of alternatives as well. This is where I iterate a lot, explore. It's again a divergent path in which I want to gather as many solutions as possible. Not all of them, but there is again a tipping point in which I have identified correctly basically where I want to go and how. And then we basically put our critical hats back on and say, okay, this solution maybe doesn't help me with reactivity on the UI because I don't know, this framework doesn't support deep reactivity. Maybe this database doesn't help me with these types of queries and so on. But at least at this point, I know about 5 types of databases and types of, I don't know, ready-made backends or CMSs and so on and so forth. And then I can eventually make the pros and cons between each one of them and find out which would be advantage me the most. And this goes through an iterative process as well, in which you prototype, you test that prototype, and start over again. For instance, for the game I've been working on, after 3 months, I've refactored the the engine, the base, the server 3 times, simply because in the first iteration, especially because I didn't have experience with coding a lot, I didn't have a lot of coding experience. I wanted to prove to myself that I can actually do this. So I know that I want to include procedural generation in my game, and I started basically doing that, trying to implement a basic noise algorithm and trying to see how that works. Okay, once I prove that to myself, now that I know this part, I know what systems I need to involve in order to support this type of thing. I know it's easier for me to identify as well what types of frameworks I want to use to render what I want to generate procedurally as well. And then in the second iteration, okay, now that I have this procedural generation, I prove to myself everything's fine. I'm just going to focus on the server right now. I'm going to leave the procedural generation aside because I need to build the basic tools and so on and so forth. I need to also see how the client might receive. It was the first time I implemented WebSockets as well. I needed to see that works. And after I've been able to prototype and test every small, not small, but every feature that I need for the game to actually be tied together, I've seen that I can implement those small versions and understand at least from a novice's perspective, all the implications of tying things like this together, I refactored it again. And okay, now I know how these should work. Let's start building an architecture about it. Let's start seeing how the project will be structured. Let's see how which type of components or packages should communicate with whom and so on and so forth. Try to basically understand, okay, I need maybe I need a logic system which basically validates everything from the client, because obviously you should never trust the client. And then maybe I want to have a data loader for config files. I don't want to hard code everything into my objects as well. And basically the same thing applies to UI as well. This is the reason I've been giving all these examples in development, because at first you produce a very crude prototype in which you have an idea. It's called a wireframe, in which, okay, I know that there will be a navigation bar. It might contain this type of information. I know that I also want to have a side menu for the page to be easier to navigate between, or maybe that would function as a tab for my UI. And then I know that on this page, I want to display this type of content. The player should be able to do this type of stuff. From there, after you've had this sketch, because this is basically what it is, then you can start making iterations on navigation bar. Okay, what would make sense to actually be here? As in, should there be any functionality? Should they just be data displayed? How do I display those resources, for instance? How do I display in a clear way what level the player has if we're talking about an RPG? Basically, you're turning the sketch into a small reality. And then from there on, you test again this whole prototype and start from scratch. Not
So
necessarily
that's
from scratch.
it's just the second diamond there. Just create the prototype to test and then kind of refine it in the middle and then settle on something and then restart in that second diamond. Is that what you're saying?
I would say restart the convergent part. You could restart the whole diamond if you want to, in which you gather again new types of solutions and so forth, but that
Just
wouldn't
always.
necessarily be the most productive way of.
Yeah.
Some people do that. I don't want to judge them. At least in my experience, I found out that just iterating on the already set solutions that we have in mind is more efficient usually. Because if you
Nice.
refactor every single time you've reached a result, you might be stuck in a loop in which you need to learn different ways of implementation. You have no idea if the solution is a better one compared to the previous one, and you need to test it again and then compare results. If you want to have a scientific approach about it, good luck as well, because you need to quantify, find some appropriate instruments and quantify that data and so on. Analysis is a beast of its own research. That's why I suggest that once you find that path in which, okay, I know that this feature should behave like this is the feedback that the player should receive, this is the reward that the player should receive as well. It acts as an incentive, but it also basically brings a new system for the player, which the player was, I don't know, because you are able to craft a hammer. Now the world of smithing is created, and good luck with that, and so on and so forth. And if you continue iterating on that same idea, you'll reach a better you would reach an answer in a quicker manner. If you keep changing the solution, then it's very hard to draw the line at some point and say, okay, if I'm really thinking very hard and as objectively as possible as the solutions, do I know which is better? Not necessarily, because I don't know if there are any ideas in the world that at least I've encountered, which from the start they were perfect. It's fine. We don't need to change anything ever again. And not necessarily we need to redefine how a pen is made, but we can look about, okay, how do we need to unscrew the cap, or do we just pull the cap, or maybe we don't use the cap at all because we have a button to press. There are lots of ways it goes about it, but basically we're not reinventing the form. We're not trying to rediscover ergonomics of how the human hand would support a writing tool as good as possible. And yeah, that's my suggestion when it comes to these types of approaches.
Yeah, I always think of an analogy that somebody told me, I think at some point, maybe I made it up. But if you tried to wash dishes after dinner and instead of just starting, you sat there and tried to make a plan for exactly what you're going to do each step of washing dishes and cleaning up, you probably would find you wouldn't even be able to do that. You would have to improvise a little bit when you run into things and uncover things. So if even just washing dishes after dinner it can be too complicated, then yeah, of course, designing a system like this or something, yeah, it's gonna be something you're gonna need to. You're never gonna be able to come up with the perfect plan at the beginning.
Luckily, some people designed at some point in time dishwashers, so it
Yes,
is a problem we managed to overcome.
my dishwasher is broken right now, so this is a very relevant problem for me. Yes, yes. I will apply the design process to my dishes tonight and see how that goes. Yeah.
This would be a starting point on how to perceive design. And there are a couple of things that I mentioned that people can Google as well and dive into more. There are a lot of experts talking about these and they deep dive into those, and they're often rabbit holes as well. So you have been warned about this. Yeah, I think this is a good starting place to basically reconsider any approaches you might have had or misconceptions and then start to build from there.
Yeah, no, this is extremely helpful. I mean, just those two things, just the two diamonds for one, but also letting go of trying to throw everything in a design bucket when I'm creating the UI and instead
Hmm.
iterate, which is something Swindle said a lot too. He just iterates and iterates and iterates, and I love his the way his game is designed. So yeah, the iteration, and then I'm really gonna look up those two diamonds, and I'll probably get some links from you to throw in the description.
Yeah, of course.
I think those two to formalize defining a principle or an idea to stick to, and then using that as a guidance for your prototyping and development. That makes total sense to me, and I definitely have been suffering the consequences of not doing that. I feel like so. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was
it
a good
can
start.
be a vicious cycle
Yeah,
if you don't care of it. Yeah, especially if you want to, especially because it's usually developers treat their games as their baby. They want it to be healthy, they want it to be
yeah,
handsome, they want it to be perfect. So you
yeah,
try to cuddle them as much as possible, but what
yeah.
you should really do is let them run, try to experiment with things. If they fall back, if they fall down, they'll get up. So yeah, this is the same thing.
Yeah, the
Not
developer.
quite, but as a concept at least.
Yeah,
Obviously, there are a lot more variables for kids.
yeah. Don't let them run on the roads.
Yeah.
Yeah, the designer for what was it? Slime Rancher said that if you want to make an interesting game, take it right up to the point where it's broken and then pull it just back from that, and that'll be really interesting. Thought that was interesting.
Yeah, you could argue at some point that it's also diamond, double diamond. That's what I was referring to with ripping the brief, taking an idea to an extreme. Yeah, just for the trying to explore what is achievable, what are the constraints, and so on. It's another lesson. It's a very good lesson, by the way. I rarely hear this type of example.
Yeah, yeah, no, there's something archetypal about it too. You know, it's like breathing. You know, everything in life breathes in and out, and you kind of, if you can formalize that process, you can capture the kind of that power of iteration in a formalized way.
Mm.
It's really powerful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Aero. Hopefully, we'll have you on again to do level two of design principles and PBBGs.
Yeah, thank you as well. It's been a pleasure. It's the first time I'm doing this, so I've definitely felt excited the whole conversation. And as you can notice, if I'm passionate about something, I'm gonna talk a lot about it. So
That's good for us.
yeah.